In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath and reflections grow deeper than they should, there are objects that remember more than they reveal. In a narrow room in Chiang Mai, a mirror once stood, silent, clouded, ordinary to the eye. But some mirrors are not meant to reflect the living. Some are meant to hold the dead. And once they have learned your face, they do not easily forget it. Tonight, we tell the story of the mirror that reflected a stranger. Chapter 1. The Mirror at Chiang Mai Night Market. The night market behind the old temple in Chiang Mai always felt different after rain. Moist air clung to the skin, heavy with the scent of incense, fried garlic, and wet stone. Lantern light flickered in shallow puddles, turning the narrow alleys into trembling rivers of gold and shadow. Nok had not intended to wander that far. She had been looking for cheap notebooks and a second-hand lamp for her rented room near the university. But the deeper she walked into the maze of stalls, the quieter the market became. The laughter of tourists faded. Music dissolved into distant echoes. Even the vendors' voices grew hushed, as if swallowed by the damp night air. At the far end of a narrow lane, she noticed a stall she didn't remember passing before. It had no electric light. Only a single oil lamp burned on the wooden table, its flame bending in the windless air. Objects lay arranged with unnatural neatness: cracked porcelain bowls, old amulets darkened by age, tarnished brass rings, faded photographs bound with thread, and fragments of carved wood. Everything looked as though it had been left behind by someone who never returned to claim it. And at the center stood a mirror. Its frame was carved from dark teakwood, etched with lotus petals worn smooth by time. The glass itself was not clear. A faint milky haze drifted beneath its surface, like thin smoke trapped inside. An elderly woman sat behind the table. Her skin was pale beneath the lamplight, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes were deep and still, reflecting the flame without warmth. "You're looking for something," she said in a soft voice. Nok startled. She hadn't realized she had stepped closer. "No, I was just passing." The old woman tilted her head slightly, studying her face as though comparing it to a memory. Then she turned the mirror toward Nok. For a brief moment, Nok thought she saw movement inside the glass, not her reflection, but a shifting darkness, like a shape withdrawing into fog. She blinked. Only her own face remained. "How much?" Nok asked, unsure why the question left her mouth. The woman named a price far lower than the mirror appeared to be worth. As Nok reached into her bag, the old woman's thin fingers closed around her wrist. They were cold, not cool from the night air, but cold in a way that felt deep, unnatural. "Do not look into it after midnight," the woman whispered. The oil lamp flame trembled, though the air was still. Nok laughed awkwardly, pulling her hand away. "It's just a mirror." The old woman said nothing more. When Nok turned to leave, the night market seemed louder again, voices returning, footsteps splashing, distant music drifting through the humid air. She glanced back once. The stall was gone. In her arms, the mirror felt heavier than it should have, its glass faintly clouded as if breathing in the damp night. And for a moment, only a moment, Nok thought she saw another face beside her own in its dim reflection. But when she looked again, she was alone. Chapter 2. The third floor room. The building stood at the end of a narrow side street not far from the university. Its concrete walls stained by decades of monsoon rain, rust streaked down from balcony rails like dried tears, and tangled electrical wires sagged overhead, humming faintly in the humid evening air. Nok had chosen the room because it was cheap. The landlord had barely looked at her when handing over the key. "Third floor, last room," he muttered, already turning back toward the flickering television behind his desk. The stairwell smelled of dust, damp paper, and something faintly metallic. Each step echoed too loudly, as if the building were hollow. By the time she reached the third floor, the sounds of the street had disappeared entirely. The corridor stretched long and dim beneath a row of failing fluorescent lights. One buzzed weakly, another flickered, the last remained dead, leaving the far end swallowed in shadow. Her room was at the very end. The door resisted slightly before opening, as though the air inside had been sealed for years. A faint chill drifted out to meet her, surprising in the tropical heat. The room was simple: a narrow bed, a wooden desk scarred with cigarette burns, a wardrobe missing one handle, and a single window overlooking a tangle of rooftops and black utility lines. But what struck her most was the silence. Not the comforting quiet of a resting place, but a heavy stillness, as if sound itself had difficulty entering. She set the mirror against the wall beside the desk. For a moment, she hesitated before unwrapping it. The teak frame seemed darker indoors. The carved lotus petals cast thin, twisted shadows across the wall. When she wiped the glass with her sleeve, the milky haze remained beneath the surface, shifting faintly as though stirred by breath. Nock told herself it was age. Humidity. Old glass always had imperfections. She positioned it upright, angling it so the window light would fall across it. Her reflection appeared dim and slightly delayed, as if it were trying to catch up with her movements. She frowned and leaned closer. The air near the mirror felt cooler. Not dramatically, just enough to raise goosebumps along her forearms. Outside, a motorbike passed below, its engine fading into the distance. Somewhere in the building, water dripped steadily, then even those small sounds vanished. Dusk deepened. The fluorescent light above her door flickered once and died, leaving the room lit only by the fading gray of evening. Nock turned on her desk lamp. Warm light spread across the floor, but the mirror seemed to swallow it. The glass dull and depthless, like a window looking into thick fog. She told herself she was imagining things. Moving felt strangely exhausting, so she lay on the bed without unpacking. The mattress springs groaned softly beneath her weight. As she drifted toward sleep, she had the uneasy sensation of being watched, not from the doorway, not from the window, but from somewhere within the room itself. She opened her eyes. The mirror stood silent beside the desk. Nothing moved. Still, she turned it slightly toward the wall before closing her eyes again. Sometime later, in that thin space between waking and sleep, Nock thought she heard a faint sound, soft and rhythmic, like someone breathing.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 3. The figure behind her shoulder. The third night in the room arrived with a suffocating stillness. The rain that had cooled the city the evening before was gone, leaving the air thick and unmoving. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed muted, as if the world outside had withdrawn and left the building suspended in a pocket of silence. Nock sat at the small wooden desk, combing her hair in slow, absent strokes. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light, while the rest of the room receded into soft shadow. Beyond the window, the sky was a dull, lightless gray. She had slept poorly since moving in. Each night she woke with the uneasy sensation that someone had been standing nearby, close enough to hear her breathing. She told herself it was only the unfamiliar room, only loneliness, only the quiet. The mirror stood propped beside the desk, angled slightly toward her. Its surface seemed darker tonight, muted, like a pond before a storm. Nock lifted her eyes. Her reflection stared back, pale from the lamplight, strands of black hair slipping over her cheek. She raised the comb and drew it slowly downward. The reflection followed, but something felt delayed. Not visibly, not clearly, just enough to make her pause. She leaned closer, studying her own face. The air near the mirror felt colder again, brushing her skin like a faint draft from an unseen crack. She exhaled softly. For a moment, the glass seemed to cloud from within. Then, she saw it. A shape behind her shoulder. Still, dark, human. Her breath caught in her throat. She did not turn immediately. Her eyes locked on the reflection, trying to make sense of what she saw. The shape stood just beyond the circle of lamplight, indistinct but unmistakably present. A person, standing very close behind her, watching. Nock's pulse thudded loudly in her ears. Slowly, she turned. The room was empty. The door remained closed. The wardrobe stood shut. Shadows pooled quietly in the corners. Nothing moved. She released a shaky breath and forced a small laugh. "You're tired," she whispered to herself. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there. Closer now. Its outline clearer against the dim background. Shoulders narrow. Head slightly tilted. As if studying her. A sharp chill ran down her spine. She jerked to her feet, knocking the chair backward. The wooden legs struck the floor with a violent crack that echoed through the silent room. She spun around again. Nothing. Only the dull glow of the lamp and the stale air pressing against the walls. Heart pounding, she reached forward and turned the mirror toward the wall. The wooden frame scraped softly across the desk. Silence rushed back in. She stood there for several long moments, listening to her breathing slow. Finally, she switched off the lamp and climbed into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Darkness settled over the room. The building creaked faintly. Somewhere, far below, water dripped in slow, hollow intervals. Nok closed her eyes. Sleep did not come. And though she kept the mirror turned away, she could not escape the certainty pressing at the edge of her thoughts. She had not been alone in the reflection. And whatever had stood behind her had not left the room. Chapter 4. Breath on the Glass. Nok woke before dawn, though she did not remember falling asleep. The room was dim and colorless, caught in that thin hour when night had loosened its grip but morning had not yet arrived. The air felt heavy, thick with humidity and an unfamiliar chill that clung to her skin beneath the blanket. For a moment she lay still, listening. No traffic. No voices. No footsteps in the corridor. Only the faint, irregular dripping somewhere deep within the building. Then she noticed her breath. It drifted faintly in the air before her face. She pushed herself upright, confused. Chiang Mai mornings were warm even before sunrise. Yet the air in the room felt cold enough to fog each exhale. Her gaze moved toward the desk. The mirror. It stood where she had turned it the night before, facing the wall. But something was wrong. The wooden frame glistened with moisture, as if it had been left outside in the rain. A thin sheen of condensation clung to the glass. Nok swung her legs off the bed and stepped closer. The floor tiles felt cold beneath her feet. She hesitated before turning the mirror back toward her. The surface was completely fogged over. Not from her breath. From the inside. Tiny droplets gathered and slid slowly downward, merging into trembling lines that caught the faint gray light of dawn. Her heartbeat quickened. She leaned closer, studying the glass. The condensation shifted. Not randomly. Not naturally. Lines began to form. Faint and uncertain at first, like a finger tracing from the other side. Nok froze. The lines deepened, connecting into shapes, curved strokes, deliberate and slow. Writing. The air in the room seemed to tighten around her chest. Letter by letter, the message revealed itself in wavering Thai script. Zia Mung Chan Nan Kane Pai. The final droplet slid downward, completing the last stroke. Nok stared, her reflection barely visible behind the milky haze. She whispered the words aloud before she realized she was speaking. Don't look at me for too long. The condensation trembled. Then, just beside the writing, another patch of fog formed. A small oval shape, like the faint impression of a mouth pressed against the glass. The sound came next. Soft. Moist. A slow exhale from the other side. Nok stumbled backward, her shoulders striking the wall. The impact jolted her into motion. She grabbed the thin cloth from the desk and wiped the mirror frantically. The fog smeared, thinning beneath her trembling hand. The writing dissolved. The oval shape vanished. When the glass cleared, only her reflection remained, pale, wide-eyed, breath shuddering in shallow bursts. The room warmed gradually as morning light seeped through the window. Outside, a motorbike engine roared to life. A distant voice called out from the street. Normal sounds returned. But Nok did not feel relief. Because even as the mirror stood clear and silent before her, a faint patch of condensation lingered near the center of the glass. Slowly fading. As if something on the other side had just stepped away.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 5. The Reflection That Didn't Sleep. By the fifth morning, Nok knew something in the room had changed. It wasn't a sound or a movement she could point to. It was a pressure, subtle but constant, like the feeling of standing too close to deep water without seeing its surface. She had barely slept. Each time she drifted off, she woke with the sensation that someone had shifted their weight nearby. Careful not to make noise. When she finally left for class, the hallway lights flickered as she passed, buzzing faintly overhead. She told herself it was faulty wiring, old building, humidity, nothing more. But the moment she stepped outside into the bright heat of late morning, the heaviness lifted from her chest. For the first time in days, she breathed easily. That evening, Molly arrived with 2 plastic bags of street food and the impatient energy of someone accustomed to noise and company. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, dropping onto the bed. "Are you sleeping at all?" "I'm fine," Knock replied, though her voice sounded thin even to herself. Molly's attention shifted to the desk. "Oh, that's beautiful," she said, pointing at the mirror. "Where did you get it?" "Night market," Knock answered quickly. "Just an old thing." Molly stood and walked toward it, chewing thoughtfully. Knock felt a sudden spike of unease. "Wait." But Molly was already standing in front of the glass. She tilted her head left, then right, examining her reflection with casual curiosity. "It's cloudy," she said. "Cheap glass, probably." She lifted a hand and waved. The reflection waved back. Nothing else happened. Molly shrugged and returned to the bed. Still pretty. Knock forced herself to relax, though her shoulders remained tight. Maybe exhaustion had been distorting her senses. Maybe the mirror was only old. Maybe. They ate in comfortable silence while the sounds of evening life filtered through the window. Motorbikes accelerating. A distant radio playing Luk Thung music. Voices drifting up from the street below. By midnight, Molly had fallen asleep, one arm thrown over her face. The room settled into darkness. Knock lay awake, staring at the faint outline of the desk across the room. The mirror stood in shadow, barely visible. She closed her eyes. Time passed. A soft murmur pulled her from the edge of sleep. She held still, listening. Someone was whispering. The voice was low and indistinct, like words spoken underwater. Molly shifted beside her but did not wake. The whispering continued. Knock pushed herself upright. The sound came from the desk. From the mirror. Her mouth went dry. She reached for the lamp switch and clicked it on. Warm light flooded the room. Silence. The mirror reflected the desk, the chair, the thin curtains stirring in the night air. Nothing moved. Her heart slowed. She exhaled and turned toward the bed. Molly was sitting upright, but her eyes were closed. Her lips moved slowly, forming words without sound. "Knock," she whispered. Knock froze. "I'm here," Knock said, her voice trembling. Molly's lips stopped moving. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond the room. Then she lay back down and resumed sleeping. Knock stared at her for a long moment before turning back toward the desk. And that was when she saw it. In the mirror, the bed was reflected clearly. Molly lay asleep beneath the thin blanket. But beside her, another figure sat upright. Still. Watching. Knock's breath stopped. She turned toward the bed. Only Molly lay there. Slowly, with dread tightening her chest, Knock looked back at the mirror. The second figure was gone. But the indentation beside Molly remained pressed into the mattress. As if someone had just risen. Chapter 6. Mirrors for the Dead. The temple grounds of Wat Suan Dok lay quiet beneath the pale haze of late afternoon. The white stupas stood in silent rows, their surfaces reflecting a muted sky, while thin ribbons of incense smoke drifted lazily through the humid air. Knock had not planned to come. But after the night's whispering and the reflection that did not belong to the living, she found herself walking through the temple gates as if guided by something beyond her own will. The air here felt different, not lighter, but ordered, still, as though unseen boundaries held the world in place. A monk in saffron robes sat beneath a Bodhi tree near the rear courtyard, sweeping fallen leaves into a careful circle. He looked up before Knock spoke, his gaze steady and patient. "You have brought something with you," he said. Nock's throat tightened. "I didn't bring it here." He studied her face for a long moment, then gestured for her to sit. The stone beneath her felt cool through the thin fabric of her skirt. For many generations, the monk began, mirrors have been used in funeral rites, not to reflect the living, but to guide the dead. Nock felt the air grow heavier around her. In old villages, he continued, a mirror was placed beside the body before cremation. It allowed the spirit to see itself, to understand it no longer belonged to flesh. A wind stirred the Bodhi leaves above them, releasing a dry whisper into the quiet courtyard. "But if the rites were incomplete," he said softly, "the spirit might not depart." Nock swallowed. "What happens then?" The monk's eyes shifted briefly, not toward her, but toward the empty space over her shoulder. "It lingers," he replied, confused, hungry for warmth, drawn to reflections, because reflections resemble the threshold between worlds. Nock's fingers curled tightly in her lap. "And if such a mirror is moved?" she asked. "Then the boundary moves with it." The words seemed to sink into the air between them. Nock thought of the night market stall. The old woman's cold fingers. "Do not look into it after midnight." "Can it be released?" Nock whispered. The monk did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the folds of his robe and produced a small thread bracelet, woven in faded red and white. "This will not protect you," he said, placing it in her palm. "It will remind you to remain within yourself." Nock stared at the thread. "What if it wants something from me?" The monk's gaze sharpened slightly. "It already does." A distant temple bell sounded, its deep tone vibrating through the courtyard. Nock turned at the sound. When she looked back, the monk was watching the space beside her again. "You must not answer if it calls," he said. The Bodhi leaves trembled once more, though the air had grown still. Nock rose slowly, bowing with uncertain hands. As she walked back toward the temple gate, the late sun cast long shadows across the ground. For a brief moment, she noticed something that made her stop. Her shadow stretched ahead of her across the stone path. But beside it, another shadow moved a fraction too late.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 7. The First Crack. By the time Nock returned to the building, evening rain had begun again, a slow, steady fall that blurred the streetlights into trembling halos. Water streamed along the gutters and dripped from sagging cables, each drop striking the pavement with a hollow rhythm that echoed through the narrow alley. She climbed the stairwell with damp sandals and the faint smell of incense still clinging to her clothes. The red and white thread bracelet rested lightly around her wrist, its fibers rough against her skin. The corridor lights flickered as she reached the third floor. Buzz. Flicker. Silence. Her door stood where she had left it. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet as she reached for the handle, a cold unease spread across her shoulders, tightening like invisible fingers. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. Not colder. Denser. As if the room had been sealed in her absence. She closed the door behind her and stood still, listening. Rain tapped softly against the window. Water dripped somewhere in the walls. The building groaned faintly, settling into the weight of the wet night. Her eyes moved to the desk. The mirror stood exactly where she had left it. But something was different. A thin line cut across the surface of the glass. Nock stepped closer, her breath shallow. It was not dust, not a streak of moisture. It was a crack. Hair thin and pale, beginning near the upper corner and descending in a crooked path toward the center. It resembled a strand of lightning frozen beneath the surface. Her reflection split along its path, dividing her face into two imperfect halves. "I didn't drop it," she whispered. The room offered no reply. She lifted her hand and hesitated before touching the glass. The moment her fingertip met the crack, a shock of cold shot through her skin, not painful, but deep and numbing, as if the chill traveled inward rather than outward. She gasped and tried to pull away. Her finger would not move. A faint vibration hummed beneath the surface. Then she heard it. A whisper. So close it seemed to form inside her own ear. "Let me out?" The words were brittle, fractured, as if spoken through broken teeth or from a throat long unused. Nock wrenched her hand back, The room snapped into stillness. Her heartbeat roared in the silence. She stumbled away from the desk, pressing her back against the wall, staring at the mirror as though it might move. Nothing did. The crack remained. The glass stood silent. Only the rain continued its patient tapping against the window. Minutes passed before she realized her hand still tingled, the cold lingering deep in her bones. She wrapped her fingers tightly around her wrist, feeling the coarse thread bracelet beneath her palm. Remain within yourself. The monk's words drifted through her thoughts. Nok forced herself to breathe slowly. The mirror did not change. Yet as the room darkened and the rain intensified, she could not shake the sensation that something had shifted, not in the glass, but in the space between her and it. As if the crack had not simply broken the mirror, but opened it. And sometime later, while the rain fell harder and the lights in the corridor died one by one, Nok thought she heard a faint sound from the desk. Not a voice, not a whisper, but the soft, dry scrape of something testing the edge of a fracture. From the other side, Chapter 8. A face that was not hers. The rain did not stop that night. It deepened, thickened, until the world beyond the window dissolved into a gray blur of falling water. The streetlights below flickered through the downpour like drowning stars, and the sound of rain striking concrete rose into a steady roar that filled the silence between Nok's breaths. Inside the room, the air felt close and unmoving. The mirror stood on the desk, its thin crack faintly visible in the dim lamplight. Nok had not dared to touch it again. She had not even moved it. Yet the presence within the room felt more pronounced now, no longer a suggestion, but a weight pressing gently against the edges of perception. Midnight passed. The building settled into deep quiet, interrupted only by distant thunder and the slow drip of water inside the walls. Nok sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the mirror from across the room. Nothing happened. Minutes slipped by. Her eyelids grew heavy. Then, without meaning to, she blinked, and in that small, unguarded instant, something changed. Her reflection was no longer looking at her. It was looking slightly to the side. Nok's breath stopped. She remained perfectly still, unsure whether movement would make it worse. Slowly, the reflection's gaze shifted back toward her. Too slowly. As if the muscles beneath its skin resisted the motion. Nok rose to her feet. The reflection stood as well, a fraction of a second late. She took one cautious step forward. The reflection followed. Another step. Closer. The crack in the glass divided her face like a fault line. She leaned nearer, heart pounding, until her reflection filled the mirror's dim surface. At first, it looked normal. Then the lamplight shifted. Shadows gathered beneath the reflection's eyes, deepening into hollow darkness. The skin along its cheeks appeared pale, not the softness of indoor light, but the dull, gray pallor of something long deprived of warmth. Nok's throat tightened. Her reflection did not breathe. She realized this with a jolt of cold clarity. Her own chest rose and fell rapidly. The figure in the mirror remained still. The lips parted slowly. Too wide. Too far. A faint dark line appeared at the corners, stretching beyond what human muscles should allow. Nok staggered backward. The reflection remained leaning forward, as if held close to the surface from the inside. Her eyes, were no longer focused on her face. They were fixed on her throat. A tremor ran through her body. She stumbled against the bed frame, unable to look away. The mirror's surface seemed to darken behind the reflection, the faint milky haze swirling slowly like smoke disturbed underwater. The figure inside tilted its head. An imitation of curiosity. An imitation of recognition. Then the lamp flickered. Darkness swallowed the room for half a heartbeat. When the light returned, Nok's reflection stood upright again. Normal. Breathing. Blinking. Exactly in time with her own movements. Nok remained frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. The rain continued to fall. Thunder rolled far across the city. And though the mirror now reflected only what stood before it, Nok could not shake the certainty that, for a brief moment, something inside the glass had been studying how to wear her face.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 9. The photograph from 1973. Morning arrived without sunlight. A pale gray sky pressed low over the city, and the rain had softened into a fine mist that blurred rooftops and power lines into smudged silhouettes. The world felt muted, as though wrapped in damp cloth. Nok had not slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw that altered reflection, the hollow gaze, the widening mouth, the patient stillness of something studying her from within the glass. By late morning, the room felt unbearable. The air seemed used, stale, watched. She wrapped the red and white thread tighter around her wrist and left the building, not bothering to lock the door. The moment she stepped into the humid daylight, the pressure eased slightly, though a faint chill lingered along her spine. Her feet carried her back through the narrow lanes toward the night market, though in daylight it was merely a corridor of shuttered stalls, folded tarps, and stacked plastic chairs. Without the lanterns and shadows, the place looked ordinary. Too ordinary. She walked to the far end of the lane where the oil-lit stall had stood. Nothing was there. Only a closed metal shutter streaked with rust. Nok hesitated, scanning the surrounding shops. Most were still closed, but a small antique store nearby had its door half open. A brass bell chimed softly as she stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and camphor. Shelves crowded the narrow space, filled with cracked porcelain, framed photographs, old clocks, and lacquered boxes. Time seemed to sit thick in the corners. An elderly shopkeeper looked up from behind a glass counter. "You're looking for something old," he said. Nok swallowed. A mirror, teak frame, lotus carvings. The man's expression did not change, but his fingers paused on the cloth he had been using to polish a small bronze bowl. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "At the night market." Silence lingered between them. Then he turned and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he carried a thin envelope, its paper yellowed with age. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward her. Inside was a black and white photograph. A young woman stood beside a dressing table, one hand resting lightly on its surface. Her hair fell straight past her shoulders. Her expression was calm, almost solemn. Beside her stood the mirror. The same dark teak frame. The same lotus carvings. The same faint clouding beneath the glass. Nok felt the air leave her lungs. On the back of the photograph, handwritten in fading ink, were a few Thai words. Niran, April 1973. Hatop Pai Doi Mithrab Sahetu. Disappeared without explanation. Nok's fingers trembled. "What happened to her?" she whispered. The shopkeeper shook his head slowly. "No body. No departure. Her family said she was in her room. The door was locked from the inside." The shop fell silent except for the faint ticking of an unseen clock. Nok stared at the photograph. The young woman's eyes seemed distant, as if focused on something beyond the camera, something standing just behind the person taking the picture. She bought the mirror shortly before she vanished. The man added, "Afterward, it was returned and sold again." A cold weight settled in Nok's stomach. "How many times?" she asked. The man's gaze held hers. "No one knows." Outside, a motorbike passed, its engine fading into the mist. Nok slipped the photograph back into the envelope, her fingers numb. As she turned to leave, the brass bell above the door gave a soft chime. She paused. For an instant, reflected in the dusty glass of a display cabinet, she thought she saw someone standing behind her. A slender figure, head tilted, watching. When she turned, the shop was empty. But as she stepped back into the pale gray morning, the envelope felt heavier in her hand, as if it contained not a photograph, but a warning that had traveled forward through time, waiting for her to see it. Chapter 10. Knocking at 3 in the morning. The mist thickened into rain again by nightfall. Water streamed down the building's exterior in glistening threads, and the neon glow from the street below bled through the downpour, painting the wet concrete walls in wavering shades of red and violet. The air inside Nok's room felt damp and unmoving, carrying the faint mineral smell of soaked cement. She returned before midnight. The envelope containing the photograph lay on the desk beside the mirror. unopened since she placed it there. She avoided looking at it, avoided looking at the glass, avoided thinking. But the room would not allow avoidance. The presence pressed in from the corners, patient, silent, aware. By 2:30 a.m., the rain softened to a thin, whispering drizzle. The building seemed suspended in a vast hush. Even the usual late-night motorbikes had vanished, leaving the world beyond the window unnaturally still. Nok lay awake, staring into darkness. Her body felt heavy, as if sleep hovered just beyond reach. Then the clock on her phone turned to 3 o'clock. A sound came from the desk. A soft tap. Nok held her breath. Silence followed. Then, tap. It was not the random tick of settling wood. Not water. Not wind. It was deliberate. Tap, tap. Slow. Measured. From the mirror. Her chest tightened. She pushed herself upright, every movement careful, as though sudden motion might invite something closer. The room remained dim, lit only by faint neon reflections filtering through the rain-streaked window. Tap. The sound came again. From inside the glass. Her feet touched the cold tile floor. Each step toward the desk felt heavier than the last. The mirror stood in shadow. The thin crack glimmered faintly like a frozen vein of lightning. Tap, tap, tap. Nok stopped an arm's length away. Her reflection emerged dimly in the darkness, pale, blurred, incomplete. The tapping ceased. Silence swelled, thick and oppressive. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from the other side of the glass, something struck once, harder. Knock. The sound vibrated through the frame and into the desk beneath it. Nok staggered backward, a cry caught in her throat. The mirror trembled slightly, then grew still. Her reflection stared forward, unmoving. A faint shape began to gather behind it. Not fully visible. Only a density in the darkness. A suggestion of depth where there should have been none. Nok's ears rang in the silence. Her pulse thundered. She forced herself to breathe. The shape did not emerge further. Instead, the surface of the glass slowly clouded near its center, moisture blooming outward like frost spreading across a frozen window. A single point formed within the fog. Then another. Then a third. 3 small circles. Arranged in a line. As if something on the other side had pressed its fingertips against the barrier. Nok stumbled back until her legs struck the bed. The condensation lingered for several seconds. Then faded. The glass cleared. Her reflection remained alone. Outside, rain resumed its steady fall. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the sky. The room returned to stillness. But Nok did not move. Because deep in the quiet, after the tapping had stopped and the glass had cleared, she felt a new certainty settle into her bones. Whatever was inside the mirror was no longer testing the boundary. It was knocking. Because it knew she was there. And it was waiting for her to answer.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 11. The Face in the Glass. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city wrapped in a damp, breathless quiet, without the steady drumming against the window. The silence inside the room felt deeper, layered, almost physical. Nok had not returned to bed. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, knees drawn close, watching the mirror as the hours crawled forward. The thread bracelet pressed into her wrist each time her pulse quickened. Its coarse fibers a small anchor against the rising tide of dread. Nothing had moved since the knocking. Nothing had spoken. Yet the room felt occupied. At 3:17 a.m., the temperature shifted. Not gradually. Not naturally. A cold seam of air spread outward from the desk, brushing across the floor tiles and creeping toward her bare feet. Her skin tightened as the chill climbed her legs, settling in her chest like ice water. The mirror's surface dimmed. Not from darkness. From depth. The faint haze within the glass thickened, swirling slowly as if stirred by an unseen current. Nok's breath came shallow and fast. A shape began to form behind her reflection. At first it appeared only as density, a region of deeper shadow where the dim light could not reach. Then the outline sharpened. Shoulders. a narrow neck, a head inclined at an unnatural angle. Nock could not move. Her reflection remained seated against the wall. The shape behind it stood upright. Closer. Nearer to the surface than before. The glass clouded in a slow bloom of moisture. And from within the fog, something pressed forward. A hand. Gray-white. Long fingers splayed against the inner surface. The skin looked swollen. The color leached away like fabric left too long in water. The fingertips flattened slightly, as if testing the barrier between worlds. Nock's throat tightened around a silent scream. Another hand emerged beside the first. The surface of the glass bowed faintly inward. Not breaking. Not yielding. Only flexing, like skin stretched too tight. Then the face appeared. It did not emerge all at once. It gathered. Features forming slowly through the condensation, hollow eyes. Colorless and depthless, sunken cheeks. Lips parted just enough to reveal darkness within. Its mouth moved. No sound came. The eyes did not look at Nock's reflection. They looked past it. Directly at her. A tremor ran through the glass. The hand slid slightly downward, leaving streaks in the fog like trails across wet clay. The mouth opened wider. The silence thickened until it rang in her ears. Then, faintly, so faintly she felt it more than heard it, a breath brushed the inside of the glass. The condensation trembled with the exhale. Nock's body finally reacted. She pushed herself backward across the tiles, her heel striking the wall. The sudden movement broke the paralysis gripping her limbs. The lamp flickered. Light faltered. Darkness surged forward for a heartbeat. When illumination returned, the mirror stood clear. Still. Only her reflection remained, pale, shaking, eyes wide with terror. The desk. The envelope. The crack dividing the glass. Nothing more. Nock pressed both hands over her mouth, forcing herself not to cry out. The room warmed slowly, as if whatever cold had filled it were retreating inch by inch. Outside, a distant bird called into the coming dawn. Morning light seeped weakly through the window. Yet even as normal warmth returned and the glass reflected only the living world, Nock could not escape the certainty carved into her thoughts. The thing inside the mirror had not tried to break through. It had pressed close enough to see her clearly. Close enough to study her face. Close enough to learn how she breathed. And as the first gray light of morning spread across the floor, a faint imprint remained on the inside of the glass. 5 elongated streaks. Slowly fading. As if something had been holding on. And had only just let go. Chapter 12. The Slow Replacement. Morning arrived in fragments. Thin light filtered through the curtains in pale strips, illuminating dust drifting in the humid air. The city had awakened, motorbikes passing, voices rising from the street below, the metallic clatter of shutters opening, yet inside the room, time seemed reluctant to move forward. Nock remained seated on the floor long after dawn. Her body felt heavy, as if she had not slept for days. When she finally stood, her joints resisted, stiff and slow, like limbs waking from a long illness. The mirror reflected her movements. Perfectly. Too perfectly. She leaned closer. Her skin looked pale beneath the morning light, but that could be exhaustion. Her eyes were ringed with shadows. Her lips dry. Nothing unnatural. Nothing impossible. Yet something felt wrong in a way she could not name, a subtle misalignment between how she moved and how her body felt from the inside. She turned away. In the bathroom down the corridor, the fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a sickly blue tint across the cracked tiles. Nock turned on the faucet and cupped water in her hands. The liquid felt warm. She splashed her face. Warm again. But when droplets slid down her neck, they felt cold. She froze. A girl from the neighboring room entered, brushing past her with a polite nod. Nock watched her reflection in the stained mirror above the sink. Normal. Blinking. Breathing. Alive. Nock lowered her gaze to her own reflection. She did not see her breath. That afternoon, Molly returned, dropping her backpack with a dull thud. "You skipped class," she said, "and you didn't answer your phone." Nock looked up slowly. "I was tired." Molly paused, studying her face. "You look different." The word lingered in the air. Nock forced a small smile. "Just lack of sleep." Molly nodded, but her expression remained uncertain. They sat together in uneasy quiet. Outside, thunder rumbled far away, though the sky remained bright. At one point, Molly shivered and rubbed her arms. "Why is it so cold in here?" she asked. "It isn't," Nock replied automatically. Molly frowned. "It feels like a freezer." Nock said nothing. That night, Molly fell asleep quickly. Nock remained awake. She sat at the desk, staring at the mirror without realizing how long she had been there. Her reflection stared back. Still. Calm. Patient. Minutes passed. Or hours. She was not sure. At some point, her eyes drifted to the thread bracelet around her wrist. The red fibers had darkened slightly, as though damp. She touched them. Cold. A faint pressure gathered at the base of her skull, not pain. But wait, like a hand resting there. Her reflection tilted its head. Nock did not move. Her stomach tightened. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand. The reflection followed. Perfectly in time. She leaned closer. Her breath should have fogged the glass. It did not. Behind her reflection, the dim haze within the mirror shifted, not forming shapes. Not yet, but moving with quiet intention, like something waiting just beyond sight. From the bed, Molly stirred in her sleep. "Nock?" she murmured. Nock did not answer. Her reflection's lips parted slightly. A movement too small to be certain. Too deliberate to ignore. The pressure at the base of her skull deepened. "Remain within yourself." The monk's voice echoed faintly in her memory. Nock blinked. For a brief instant, she felt disoriented, as if she had been standing somewhere else and had just returned to her body. Her reflection blinked a fraction too late. She stumbled backward, knocking the chair against the wall. The sound shattered the stillness. Molly shifted but did not wake. The mirror stood silent once more. Normal. Unmoving. Yet as Nock pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the uneven rhythm of her heart, a chilling thought surfaced, not sudden, but inevitable. Whatever lived inside the mirror was no longer trying to come out. It was making space. And something inside her was beginning to move aside.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 13. The Ritual of Breaking. By late afternoon, the sky darkened without warning. Clouds gathered in slow, heavy layers above Chiang Mai, turning the air metallic and still. Even the birds seemed to vanish from the tangled power lines outside the window. Inside the room, the silence had weight. Nock sat on the edge of the bed, the thread bracelet wound tight around her wrist. The faint cold at the base of her skull had not left since the night before. It pulsed gently now, like a second heartbeat, patient, waiting. Molly stood near the door, her arms folded. "I'm staying tonight," she said. "Something is wrong here. I can feel it." Nock did not argue. She handed Molly the envelope containing the photograph. Molly studied the image, her brow tightening. "She disappeared?" Nock nodded. The mirror was in her room. The word room seemed to sink into the air between them. They returned to Wat Suan Dok before sunset. The temple grounds glowed faintly in the dying light. White stupas tinted gray beneath the approaching storm. The monk who had spoken to Nock before waited beneath the Bodhi tree, as though he had expected her return. "You have waited too long," he said quietly. Nock lowered her eyes. "Is there a way to stop it?" Molly asked. The monk regarded them both, then drew a slow breath. "If the spirit is bound within the mirror, it must be released before it takes a new vessel." Nock felt the cold pulse at the base of her skull intensify. "How?" she whispered. "Before sunrise," he said, "while the boundary between night and day is weakest." He spoke carefully, each instruction measured. "Burn incense to guide the spirit. Chant to remind it of its path. Break the mirror as the first light appears. Do not look into the glass when it shatters." The wind stirred the Bodhi leaves above them. "And if we fail?" Molly asked. The monk's gaze shifted toward Nock. "Then the spirit will not leave alone." Night fell with violent rain. Thunder rolled over the city in deep, echoing waves as they returned to the room. The corridor lights flickered erratically, plunging the hallway into alternating bands of brightness and shadow. Inside, the air felt colder than ever. The mirror stood waiting on the desk. The crack had spread, branching into thin fractures that resembled veins beneath skin. Nock placed 3 sticks of incense in a ceramic cup and lit them with trembling hands. Thin threads of smoke curled upward, drifting toward the mirror as if drawn by an unseen current. Molly sat beside her, clutching the prayer sheet the monk had given them. The chanting began softly, low, uncertain. The storm outside roared against the building, wind pressing rain against the window in violent bursts. The mirror's surface dimmed. The fractures glimmered faintly. The smoke thickened near the glass, circling slowly. Nock's voice faltered. The pressure in her skull deepened, spreading downward along her spine. A faint vibration hummed through the desk. Molly's chanting grew louder. The air tightened. The fractures in the glass darkened, spreading like ink through water. And from deep within the mirror came a sound, not knocking, not whispering, but a long, shuddering breath. The incense smoke bent sharply toward the glass. Nock's reflection appeared through the haze. Still, watching. Her lips parted, though Nock had not moved. Molly grabbed her arm. Don't look at it. Nock squeezed her eyes shut. The vibration intensified, traveling through the floor and into her bones. Thunder cracked overhead. The first hint of gray light pressed against the edge of the curtains. Dawn was coming. The mirror trembled. The fractures widened with faint, brittle sounds. Molly raised the hammer they had brought from the landlord's storage room. Now, she whispered. Nock forced herself to keep her eyes closed. The room seemed to inhale. And as the first pale thread of dawn pushed through the darkness, the mirror released a sound like something stretching after a long confinement. The hammer began its descent. And in the instant before impact, Nock felt a sudden, terrifying certainty. Something inside the glass was reaching out. Not to escape, but to trade places. Chapter 14. The Moment of Exchange. The hammer struck. A sound like cracking ice exploded through the room, sharp, brittle, impossibly loud in the thin hour before sunrise. The impact shuddered through the desk, the floor, the walls, vibrating up through Nock's bones as if the building itself had been struck. She kept her eyes closed. The monk's warning rang in her thoughts. Do not look into the glass when it shatters. A second blow fell. The fractures spread instantly, branching outward in jagged lines that raced across the surface like lightning seeking ground. The mirror screamed. There was no other word for it. A high, tearing sound erupted from the glass, rising beyond the range of ordinary noise, piercing the air with a resonance that seemed to vibrate inside Nock's skull rather than in the room. Molly gasped. It's breaking. Wind slammed against the window. Rain struck the walls in furious sheets. The incense smoke twisted violently, pulled toward the mirror in spiraling currents. The glass burst. Not outward. Inward. A vacuum force tore the fragments toward the center, as if the mirror had become a collapsing void. The air rushed forward, dragging the incense smoke, dust, and the thin curtain at the window into a whirling funnel of motion. Nock felt the pull immediately. It seized her breath, tightening her chest as though invisible hands pressed against her ribs. A roar filled her ears. Voices layered within it, whispers overlapping whispers, fragments of words too fractured to understand. Molly screamed her name. Nock, don't open your eyes. But something inside her wanted to see. The pressure at the base of her skull flared into searing cold. A second awareness pressed forward from within, not foreign, not separate, but insistent, as if another gaze were aligning with her own. The pull intensified. Her body lurched forward an inch across the floor. Her fingers clawed against the tiles. Her bracelet snapped tight against her wrist. A breath brushed her ear. Not outside. Inside. Let me out. Her eyes flew open. The world lurched. Where the mirror had stood was no longer a surface but depth, a shifting gray void threaded with drifting smoke and fragments of dim reflections that did not belong to the room. And within that depth stood a woman, her skin gray and swollen, her eyes hollow and white, her mouth open in a silent, endless gasp. But the face was no longer entirely unfamiliar. It was wearing Nock's features. The thing raised its hand. Nock felt her own hand lift in answer. "No." Molly's voice broke through the roar. She grabbed Nock's shoulders, pulling backward with desperate strength. The void convulsed. The woman's face twisted, features stretching between identities: stranger, reflection, imitation, self. The room shook. A thunderclap split the sky. And in that violent instant, Nock felt herself being pulled in two directions, her body anchored by Molly's grip. Her awareness drawn toward the gray depth where the hollow-eyed woman reached with terrible longing. The first ray of dawn pierced the window. Light struck the shattered frame. The void collapsed inward with a violent snap. Air rushed back into the room. Glass fragments rained onto the floor in a brittle cascade. Silence fell. The storm receded into distant thunder. Molly lay sprawled across the tiles, still gripping Nock's shoulders, breathing in ragged bursts. The desk stood splintered. The mirror was gone. Only jagged shards remained scattered across the floor, reflecting pale morning light. Nock stared ahead, trembling. Her chest rose and fell. Her heart hammered. She was here. She was breathing. She was. Molly slowly released her and pushed herself upright, eyes searching Nock's face with desperate urgency. "Nock," she whispered. Nock turned toward her. Her expression was calm. Too calm. The room warmed as sunlight spread across the broken glass. Outside, the city resumed its morning rhythms: distant engines, voices, the ordinary pulse of life returning. Molly exhaled in relief, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's over," she said. Behind Nock, in one of the largest shards lying face up on the floor, a faint reflection trembled in the growing light. The surface did not show the ceiling, or the window, or the scattered debris. It showed a dim gray depth. And within it, something slowly withdrawing, as if the exchange had not failed, but simply chosen its moment.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 15. The One Who Remains. Morning settled over Chiang Mai with deceptive gentleness. Sunlight spread across the rooftops in pale gold, drying the rainwater that clung to tangled wires and concrete ledges. Vendors reopened their stalls. Motorbikes threaded through narrow streets. Voices rose, ordinary and alive. Inside the third floor room, the air felt warmer, lighter. The storm had passed. Shards of glass lay scattered across the floor like frozen fragments of light. Molly moved carefully between them, sweeping the larger pieces into a cardboard box the landlord had provided. Each shard reflected splintered glimpses of ceiling, window, sky. Nothing unnatural. Nothing impossible. She kept telling herself that. Nock sat quietly on the edge of the bed, hands folded loosely in her lap. Her posture was composed, almost restful, as if the past nights had drained something from her and left behind an unfamiliar stillness. "You should rest," Molly said gently. "We both should." Nock nodded. Her movements were precise, unhurried, measured in a way that made Molly pause, though she could not say why. By noon, the broken frame had been carried away. The floor had been wiped clean. Only faint scratches on the desk remained where the mirror had stood. The room looked ordinary again. That frightened Molly more than anything. Classes resumed. Days passed. Life insisted on continuing. Nock returned to lectures, though she spoke little. When friends greeted her, she responded with a faint, polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You look better," one classmate told her. She nodded. "Yes. Better." At night, Molly sometimes woke to find Nock sitting upright in bed, looking toward the desk. Not frightened. Not tense. Simply watching the empty space where the mirror had once stood. When Molly asked what she was doing, Nock would blink slowly, as if returning from far away. "Nothing," she would say. One evening, As the sky burned orange behind distant mountains, Molly noticed something small but unsettling. Knox stood before the wardrobe mirror, adjusting her hair. The glass reflected the room clearly. The bed, the desk, the fading light. But Knox's reflection blinked a fraction too late. Molly told herself it was imagination. Fatigue. Memory lingering where fear had lived too long. She said nothing. Weeks passed. The red and white thread bracelet remained on Knox's wrist. The fibers had darkened with wear, yet she never removed it. Sometimes Molly noticed Knox pressing her thumb against it absent-mindedly, as if confirming something remained anchored. Sometimes, in certain light, Knox's skin appeared faintly gray, only for a moment, only at the edge of perception, before warmth returned. And sometimes, when Knox believed herself alone, her lips moved silently, shaping words too soft to hear. Late one night, Molly rose for water and paused in the doorway. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a dim silver glow across the floor. Knox stood barefoot among the shadows. Still, facing the empty desk, Molly followed her gaze. Nothing stood there, only darkness. Then Knox spoke, not loudly, not softly, but with quiet certainty. "You can't come through anymore." Silence filled the room. Seconds passed. Knox tilted her head slightly, as if listening. Her shoulders relaxed. "I know," she whispered. Molly stepped backward before the floorboard could creak beneath her foot. She did not ask what Knox had heard. She was no longer certain she wanted to know. Months later, at a small shop near the night market, a vendor carefully arranged a tray of old objects beneath a hanging lamp. Among them lay several irregular shards of antique glass, their edges dulled, their surfaces faintly clouded beneath age. A tourist paused, lifting one piece to examine it. Within the cloudy surface, the faint reflection of the shop lights shimmered. And for an instant, only an instant, it seemed another face lingered behind the reflection, watching patiently from a depth that had no end. The vendor smiled. "Old mirror," she said, "very rare." Back in the third-floor room, Knox slept peacefully. Her breathing was slow, even, calm. On the bedside table, a small shard no larger than a coin lay beside her phone, its surface dull, its reflection indistinct. In the thin hours before dawn, condensation briefly fogged its surface. A faint oval shape appeared, then faded. Knox did not wake, but her lips curved slightly, as if responding to a voice heard only in dreams. Some say the mirror was destroyed. Others say it was only broken. And broken things have a way of traveling. If you ever find an old mirror with glass that seems slightly dim, slightly deeper than it should be, do not stare too long. Because reflections remember. And if one day your reflection hesitates before copying your movements, it may not be imitating you. It may be replacing you. Sleep well. And avoid the mirrors before dawn.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.